I've been playing a lot of classic WoW recently, and the other day I hopped onto retail just to see what's been going on as Blizzard gets ready for Dragonflight. While I was playing, I watched a video from Venruki, a PvP god, where he talked about how Shadowlands PvP damage doesn't feel as good as it did in previous expansions. In the video, he calculates and explains all the variables that go into an ability's damage output. In comparing Wrath Classic and Shadowlands, you can basically see the differences in combat philosophy at its core. In Wrath, you had 3 variables when calculating damage of an ability, and in Shadowlands, you had close to 10. And that's just core ability variables. That doesn't account for expansion mechanics like conduits. Venruki's point was that the PvP damage numbers don't feel as good anymore because you're putting 3 times the effort to deal the same amount of relative damage. But as I was watching this, it's a great video by the way, I highly recommend watching it fully for yourself, I thought about the other consequences of this design. In addition to being incredibly convoluted, what the Shadowlands combat design does is focus on a damage window, where your class is fully buffed up to be able to pump adequate DPS. In PvP, that means depending on your class, you have a certain time period to wait before all your cooldowns are back up and you can attack someone new. PvP gameplay nowadays seems to be a mix of a bunch of modifier cooldowns that you have to max out in one go to be able to put enough damage in one short burst window to outdamage the opponent during their damage window. But I'm not really a PvP guy, you should watch Venruki for that. I want to talk PvE because this affects raiding and Mythic Plus dungeons too, and it alters the way that players think about the game as a whole. PvE combat has changed a lot since the Wrath of the Lich King days, and the emphasis on the cooldown window is kind of the result of it. In Shadowlands, you don't do much damage with your normal abilities, you buff your cooldown window and wait for the perfect moment to bust out all of your damage in one short seconds-long combo. Just like in PvP, the cooldown window is a short time frame in which you pop all of your strongest damage abilities and all of your strongest modifier abilities to maximize your damage output. After that cooldown period is over, you enter a maintenance mode, where you spam your basic abilities at their base damage and try not to screw up your DPS meter too much. So what does this mean for combat? Well, when you're raiding, over the course of a boss fight, you have a certain amount of times that you can actually do your full cooldown ability rotation, and you need to maximize those cooldown rotations or you are technically underperforming. That means hitting your abilities perfectly in order so as not to fuck up the cooldown window, because if you mess it up, you'll have to wait a full minute or more before the cooldown abilities are ready and you're able to try again. Now in a normal situation, messing up isn't a big deal, but in raids, fucking up your main damage rotation can mean the difference between the top and bottom of the DPS meters. It could mean several minutes of low damage in a raid encounter that only lasts 8 minutes, or less if your raid wipes because of a failed DPS check. However, if you happen to get everything right, you press all your buttons at the right time in the correct order and pump your damage to the fullest, God, does it feel satisfying to see those big numbers on the screen. Seriously, it feels like you just scored a touchdown at the Super Bowl when you perfect your cooldown window and see your name at the top of the DPS meter. Not that I ever did that, but that's what I hear. The last thing to understand about the cooldown window is that every class has a different level of dependency on it. Off the top of my head, combat rogues, arms warriors, and maybe elemental shamans have the least dependency on it, whereas the fire mage basically only does damage in the burst window. But every class will lose a significant amount of damage if they don't utilize their cooldown window to its highest potential. The reason I bring this up is because I'd love to get all your opinions on this type of combat. I don't have a finger on if the WoW community likes this type of burst combat or if the shift has become a little too much. I think the first thing I want to say is, WoW's combat is incredibly smooth, and its quality for a tab targeting MMORPG is top tier. Spells feel impactful, abilities are responsive. I think we can all agree that as tab targeting combat goes, this is one of the best. Doesn't mean it can't be better though, so here's where my head's at with the cooldown windows. In a nutshell, taking raids as an example, it's much more stressful to have so much importance put on a single minute of an 8-minute fight. I'll take Fire Mage as an example, not only because that's the one that I know best, but it's also the class that is the most dependent on the cooldown window. Fire Mages have an ability called Combustion. It's on a 2-minute cooldown and lasts for 16 seconds. During this 16-second window, every single one of your spells will crit and your burns will do more damage depending on how much mastery you have. Mastery for fire mages directly affects the damage over time your fire spells inflict on the target. So not only is your combustion providing crazy burst damage from the critical damage spells, but it's also slowly burning the target for a percent of whatever damage you inflict during that time, a percentage that's increased by the amount of mastery you have. On top of this, fire mages have a passive called Hot Streak, which gives you an instant cast Power Blast for every 2 critical strikes that you get in a row. So as you can probably tell, this is the fire mage's damage window. I'm not going to get into actual calculations, but trust me when I say this combustion damage window allows for an insane amount of damage within a short 16 seconds. The problem is that this damage window only happens every 2 minutes and lasts for 16 seconds. So for a minute and 44 seconds, you have to use normal spells. For fire mage, this means spamming Fireball and Fire Blast until you build a Hot Streak to launch another Pyroblast. This does next to no damage compared to the burst damage within the 16-second window. The combustion window is like a drug. It's so euphoric to hit all of the combos of Fire Blast and Phoenix Flames to proc your hot streak and slam the enemy with a full buffed Pyroblast, but then it's over, and you lose all of your buffs. Your damage gets super low and you're back to hard casting until you get the procs the natural way. And the low lasts so much longer than the high. What's more is that if you want to do the most damage and play your class how it's intended, then you need to build your character around the 16-second high and make it the highest possible high that you can attain. Not sure if this is still the case because I haven't been keeping up with the meta lately, but this is the main reason why all fire mages went with the Fairy Covenant. The Night Fae gave mages the ability called Shifting Power, which reduces your cooldowns by 16 seconds over a short channeling period. Your conduits are built for the same reason, buffing your Pyroblast and your combustion window or increasing the cooldown reduction of Shifting Power. Your talents are chosen for this as well, taking things like Searing Touch to guarantee critical hits on targets below 30% health, and Kindling to reduce the cooldown of combustion by 1 second for every critical strike. So with this build, you're taking the 2-minute cooldown to about 1 minute and 15 seconds, give or take a few seconds. You have the Rune of Power talent and Conduits, Legendaries, Covenant, and Trinket choices that buff your 16-second damage window, but what happens during your downtime? Nothing really. It feels really bad to be a fire mage during downtime. If you aren't in the combustion window, you're working hard to get back into that window. But okay, let's stop picking on fire mages. What about other classes? Well, every class has a damage window. Even classes that focus on damage over time have cooldown windows where their damage over time abilities do more damage. This would be a class like Affliction Warlock or even Feral Druids for bleeds. Warriors have Colossal Smash and Avatar, which are 45 seconds and 1.5 minute cooldowns respectively. But to be fair, warriors do have some damage outside of their cooldown windows. Really what you're asking when playing each class is, how long is the interval between damage windows, or how much does the class rely on the damage window? I would say my only issue with this type of combat is how it affects the mindset of the player base. The complexity around how to build the damage within that damage window causes players to min-max, or be forced to take specific min-max builds, and it feels terrible to not maximize your damage output for that short period of time. What's worse is if you miss it, you missed it, and you cannot get that damage back. And because that fear of missing or messing up your cooldown window is so strong, you end up basing your gameplay around it, practicing specific ability rotations, looking up a build to make it easier to hit higher amounts of DPS, or basically just min-maxing the hell out of it so you don't have to feel the shame of low damage in a raid. I can tell you from experience that when I raided for the first time with my fire mage, I would feel so powerful when I hit my combustion window rotation perfectly. It was so satisfying to throw huge balls of fire every second and see the rising damage numbers, but that did not happen every time. In fact, most of the time, because the raid mechanics required me to move or perform some action, I didn't get the full damage output of the combustion window. Top tier raiders know when and where to proc their combustion windows and maximize the number of time you use combustion in a single boss encounter. That's not me. I'm not that good, so instead I have to react to DBM and choose not dying over being top damage. So every time I would hit my combustion window, I would get as much damage as possible while staying alive. And that meant that I was third from the bottom out of the DPS in my guild's raid team. But that's not relevant, I'm just bad. But the point I'm trying to make is that there's no way to make up that damage you lost by not optimizing the 16-second window, which makes the rest of the encounter where you're in maintenance mode pretty much pointless in my opinion. The other downside to this is the complexity when it comes to building your character around the damage window. Like I've said, your entire build is based around maximizing the amount of damage that you can do within that short time frame, and while some classes rely on this window less, every class needs to optimize it to pump the most damage. To maximize the combustion window damage, a fire mage needs to take specific talent choices. They need to join a specific covenant. They need to use specific conduits and a specific soulbind. They need to build specific stats and find specific trinkets, and they need to use specific legendaries. If they do not, they will fall heavily behind in DPS and risk losing their spot in a raid team. How easy is that for a new player to learn? I know, you're probably sick of me saying that WoW makes it difficult for new players to learn the game, but this is a big part of it. It's not that easy to min-max without the use of a guide. Going back to Venruki's video on calculating damage, there are just way too many factors that affect your damage output these days, which means for a new player, they need to learn absolutely everything if they want to get to the base level of competency that is required to play with veterans of the game. And if new players don't look up builds for each class that they want to play, they won't know how to pump adequate DPS or even tank or heal efficiently. If they don't follow a guide that tells you exactly what to do and how to play your character in the optimal way, then they are left having to learn by trial and error, and we all know that that usually isn't the best experience in World of Warcraft. So in my opinion, I like the cooldown window and its complexity, but it brings a couple downsides to how combat and the game in general is played, and it affects how easily new players can pick up the game and get into content with a base level of understanding. I'm in no way an expert on World of Warcraft combat, this is just the way it seems to me and I wanted to point it out. I play both Classic and Retail, and even though both have classes with powerful cooldowns, they just don't seem as complicated or necessary in Wrath Classic. But I'd rather hear what you think. Do you like the way combat has evolved in retail WoW, or do you like the slower, less bursty combat of Wrath Classic? Do you agree that cooldown windows are as important as I'm saying they are? Let me know in the comments. But most importantly, I hope you enjoyed the video. Leave a like if you liked it and subscribe for more content. I hope you enjoy your classic or retail Azeroth adventures, and I can't wait to see what we talk about next.